Good morning. Thank you all for joining today's Science, Conservation, and Humanities lecture presented by the New York Botanical Garden. My name is Charles Zimmerman, and it is my pleasure to welcome you from locations across the United States and around the world to today's webinar, Darwin's Passion for Plants. At any time during today's event, please feel welcome to submit questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your window, and our host will raise these for our speaker to answer at the end. Live captions can also be enabled by clicking the CC button, then show subtitles or view full transcript. This event is being recorded and will be shared on the NYBG lecture library. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Barbara Ambrose, Director of Laboratory Research and Associate Curator of Plant Genomics at the New York Botanical Garden, who will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Robbin Moran.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robbin Moran, Curator Emeritus at the New York Botanical Garden. Robbin was a curator at the New York Botanical Garden for 23 years. His research specialty is lycophyte and fern systematics and taxonomy. In other words, he studies lycophytes and ferns. He's discovered 115 new species, 5 new genera, and 1 new family. He figures out the features that ferns share and what makes them distinct, and how ferns are all related to each other. He's also taught hundreds of students through courses in tropical field botany, and he has also trained several Ph.D. students who now have active careers studying lycophytes and ferns themselves. He's also had 7 new species named for him and 1 new genus, Moran, and according to my 9-year-old son, this must make him worldwide famous. Robbin has graciously agreed to give a seminar at a future date regarding his career at the New York Botanical Garden. I encourage you to attend it because if you don't know what lycophytes and ferns are, then trust me, after hearing Robbin talk about them, you will love these non-seed plants. But today, Robbin will share his passion and knowledge about Darwin and with a particular focus on Darwin's work with plants. Please help me welcome Dr. Robbin Moran.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll share my screen. All right. Well, thank you, Barbara, for that very kind introduction. And welcome to all of you. Good morning. I'm glad you could join us today. I'm going to talk about Darwin and plants, and I love talking about this subject. Darwin was a major botanist of the latter half of the 1800s. After The Origin of Species was published, he wrote 6 books that were entirely dedicated to plants. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about in this presentation today. And the thing is that most people don't, when they think of Charles Darwin, they don't think of him as a botanist, but he definitely was a major botanist. And let's see, excuse me, but I'm having, there we go. This is a cover from the 2009 issue of the scientific journal Nature, and it came out in conjunction with the anniversary, the 200th anniversary of his birth. He was born on February 12th, 1809. And I love this very colorful illustration. I think there's maybe 10 or 11 species surrounding Darwin here. There's barnacles on his arm. Here's a Galapagos tortoise, but only one of these organisms is a plant. And that's this Angraecum orchid, which I'll say more about, that's nestled in his arm. And I love this illustration, but it's a very, what I would call zoocentric view of Darwin. And Darwin was definitely more of a botanist than you get from this illustration. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Darwin really made his first mark in biology by taking this voyage of the Beagle that lasted 5 years. And I wanted to mention something about that before I get into the plant books. Here's the Beagle that you see up here. And down here in the lower left is the route that they used to circumnavigate the world. They spent a lot of time in southern South America mapping the coastline of that continent. And here's Darwin and how he looked at about the time he took the voyage. Now, what was Darwin doing on the Beagle? A curious little fact is that he was not the naturalist aboard the Beagle. The naturalist on the Beagle officially was the ship's surgeon. And what Darwin was doing on the Beagle, he was invited to be there as the gentleman dining companion to the captain of the ship, Captain Robert Fitzroy. And here's a picture of Fitzroy. Fitzroy invited Darwin because he was worried about the psychological effects of a prolonged sea voyage. These naval voyages were often very long. The Beagle voyage, the second voyage, was 5 years long. And in the English Navy, the captain of a ship was master and commander, and he had very limited social interactions with the crew. If he wanted to order the crew to do something, he would pass that order down through his subordinate officers. And there was a cadre of maybe 10 or 12 officers that he interacted with. And even that interaction with fellow officers was somewhat formal. And in other words, he was at sea for a long time, sometimes many months between ports, and he had a small number of people that he interacted with. And these voyages were arduous, long, dangerous, stressful, and that could bring out problems with anxiety and depression. And in fact, the first captain of the very first Beagle voyage committed suicide in the Straits of Magellan and Tierra del Fuego, excuse me. And he, that is Fitzroy, was very much aware of this. And Fitzroy was also aware that he had a problem with mental illnesses in his family tree. His famous uncle, the Viceroy Castlereagh, who was a well-known English politician and statesman, he committed suicide by slitting his throat with a razor. And so Fitzroy was very worried about the psychological effects of this long voyage, and he invited Darwin to join the Beagle, not as the ship's naturalist, although Darwin was certainly permitted and encouraged to do natural history work, but he was there officially as the captain's official dining companion, so that Fitzroy could have a somewhat normal relationship with another human being, and that would help keep him sane during this long, arduous voyage. By the way, Fitzroy, at age 60, well after the Beagle voyage was over, he did commit suicide by slitting his throat with a razor. So it was probably good he had Darwin along. Now, I also, besides that relationship with Fitzroy, I want to mention these two botanists. They were very important in helping Darwin develop his ideas and bouncing ideas off of these with these botanists, and also sending Darwin plants. This first person is Joseph Dalton Hooker. He was the director of Kew. He succeeded his father, the director of the Kew Botanical Gardens, the famous, beautiful botanical garden in England. And Hooker and Darwin were good friends, and any plant that Darwin wanted for his studies, for these 6 books that I'm going to describe, Hooker would send to Darwin these plants so that Darwin could study them. And also, Darwin just discussed the ideas of evolution and particularly natural selection with Hooker, and Hooker helped him develop his theory. Asa Gray was an American botanist at Harvard University. He also sent Darwin plants, but he had a long correspondence with Darwin. And it was, the two men were very close friends. When The Origin was published in 1859, Darwin allowed Gray to negotiate the royalties with the publisher of the American edition, Appleton's publisher in Boston. And he allowed Darwin allowed Gray to keep the royalties, and Gray then invested that in his botanical work. One of Darwin's 6 books that are completely dedicated to plants, it is dedicated to Asa Gray. And then Asa Gray wrote a short foreword for one of the books. So the two men were very close. So these two botanists had a very important relationship with Darwin. After Darwin returned from the Beagle, he went to Down House in England, and that's where he raised his family. Here's a picture of the back of Down House, and you can see in the foreground right here these beds. In Darwin's time, those were filled with plants that he was experimenting on and doing crosses and so forth. Here's his study where he wrote most of his works. And Darwin had greenhouses built. This is in the back of the of Down House, not attached to the house, but in the back. And he had a series of greenhouses built. It looks like they're all one greenhouse here, but my understanding, this is 5 different greenhouses here. And here's what it looks like inside. And I love this colorful picture of Darwin working with his plants inside the greenhouse. Nobody builds 5 greenhouses unless they're really serious, a serious plant person. And at the height of his activity of these researches on plants, he employed 3 full-time gardeners. So he was a very serious plant person, no doubt about it. Here's outside of that greenhouse in the lawn behind Down House, there were experimental beds. And here they are shown with the greenhouse in the background. When Darwin died, he left in his will a sum of 200 pounds to initiate the indexing effort for Index Cuensis, which was a list of all the botanical names that had been published since 1753, which is the starting point of botanical nomenclature. That's when Linnaeus published Species Plantarum. And Darwin left this money to Kew, I think in a way of saying thank you to Hooker for all the plants that Hooker had sent to Darwin over the years, and Darwin did research on. So this is a major work, a major reference for anybody doing work on plant taxonomy. And today, this work is available online in the form of the International Plant Names Index, which is called IPNI. So Darwin had a hand in this, and he really was a plants person, very interested in plants, unlike his contemporaries, many of whom were primarily interested in describing new species and genera. Darwin wasn't interested in that. He was interested in what these plants were doing out there in nature, how they adapted and evolved and grew and reproduced. And that's what he describes mostly in these books. The first edition of The Origin of Species was published in November of 1859, and the book went through 6 different editions. The last edition, I think, was 1872, and that last edition, with every subsequent edition, he added more examples. But that last 6th edition has many plant examples. So if you're a botanist and you want to buy a copy of The Origin of Species, I would recommend getting that last edition. Now, his first book is this one here. It's on the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are pollinated by insects. In this book, he studied 15 genera of British orchids and about 50 genera of foreign orchids. And he loved dissecting their flowers. He didn't always have live material, although most of what he had was sent to him from Hooker at Kew. Sometimes he had to make do with dried pressed herbarium specimens. And Darwin loved dissecting the flowers and trying to figure out how they worked, how they interacted with their pollinator so that pollen could be deposited on the head or the thorax or the abdomen of the insects, wherever, and then be transferred to another flower. Now, what Darwin found was, of all the species that he studied, he only found 2 instances where plants were selfing, that is pollen, and orchids have their pollen in pollinia, these waxy masses of pollen. And those pollen masses are transferred to the insect. And in all but 2 instances, he found that these flowers were adapted for outcrossing. That is, the pollinia from the flower on one plant being transferred to the flower on a different plant, a separate individual. And this was completely unexpected at the time. Most people did not believe that there was much outcrossing in the plant world. It was very controversial. But Darwin found that that was the rule. These plants had specific adaptations to promote outcrossing, going from the flower of one individual to the flower of another individual on a different plant. And he wondered, why should that be? Why should the general rule be outcrossing? Well, I'm going to tell you the answer to that because Darwin spent 11 years on another book, which I'll tell you about, one of these 6 books, and looking at that question, what are the relative advantages and disadvantages to outcrossing? This book is so interesting and rich in detail and examples. I could just easily expand it into a 2 or 3 hour lecture. It has many fascinating examples of adaptations in orchids and how they're pollinated. But let me just give you this one. It's perhaps the most famous. This is the Star of Bethlehem orchid. It's Angraecum sesquipedale is the scientific name. And that specific epithet, sesquipedale, means 1.5 feet long. And what it refers to is this long green spur that you can see. I'm trying to put my cursor over it here. That long green spur, it's about 11, 12 inches long, about 30 centimeters long. And down at the base is where the nectar collects. Now, this species is endemic to Madagascar. It's an epiphyte. It occurs up in the branches of trees. It's not rooted in the ground. And Darwin surmised that, or hypothesized, it must have a pollinator, an insect pollinator that has a tongue 11 or 12 inches long, 30 centimeters long, that can get all the way to the bottom of this nectar spur, all the way down here, and sip that nectar, because that's the reward for the pollinator. So he hypothesized there must be an insect that exists, probably a hawk moth, because that group has the longest tongues of any insects, that pollinated this orchid. Well, he was ridiculed by entomologists for this. And, you know, today, I don't think this is very astounding to us. Of course, there's going to be a pollinator that has a tongue that long that can get down to that nectar. But in Darwin's day, people felt that this long spur didn't have any function at all. It really didn't even need to be explained. There was nothing to be explained. Some people even argued that that long spur was just put there by God to please our eyes, to look pretty. And Darwin said, no, if my theory of evolution by natural selection is correct, then natural selection must have fashioned that long spur. It must have a purpose, an adaptive significance, so that selection can see it and have molded that organ. So he hypothesized that there must be this sphingid moth, this hawk moth with a very long tongue. And I think about 10 or 12 years after he published his book, entomologists in Madagascar found a hawk moth that had a tongue long enough, and they eventually found other specimens of this hawk moth that had the pollinia, the little waxy, sticky pollen masses stuck to the proboscis, the tongue of that insect, which was pretty strong evidence that that hawk moth was indeed pollinating the orchid. And it wasn't until, I think, 1980 or thereabouts that this hawk moth was actually videoed pollinating the orchid. And you can go to YouTube. There are several videos showing the pollination of this orchid by the hawk moth, and they're just amazing. The hawk moth hovers in front of the flower, and then it unrolls this very long tongue, and then it moves forward and inserts that tongue down into the spur to sip the nectar. It's really, really dramatic. So this is his book on the fertilization of orchids, many fascinating examples. But he showed that these adaptations for orchids, their bumps, their spurs, their color patterns, were there for insect pollination, and they had many adaptations to transfer that pollen from one flower on a single plant to another flower on a different plant. Cross-pollination was the general rule in the plant world. So the movement and habits of climbing plants is Darwin's next book. And this is one of my favorite books. He talks about different kinds of climbing plants here. He points out there's basically 5 different kinds of climbers. There's plants like you see here on the left. This is Strychnos, the strychnine genus, gives us the poison strychnine. And strychnine is a hook climber. It has these modified branches that are like hooks, and that's how it climbs on the surrounding vegetation. You have something like ivy that has a long creeping stem, and on the lower surface of that stem, roots are produced that secrete a glue. and that glues that long creeping stem to the support plant, and that's how those plants climb. Darwin really was not interested in these two kinds of climbers because there's no specific movements that are associated with them. Darwin was more interested in climbing plants that showed a definite movement associated with their climbing. And he recognized these three different categories. He recognized stem climbers that twine by the stem wrapping around a support. There are leaf climbers that have leaf stalks and the midrib of the leaf that are sensitive to touch. That's called thigmotropism, is a technical term for that. And these plants climb when the petiole or the leaf midrib touch a support, and they will twist in response to that touch around the support and grab onto it. They usually thicken up. There's a thickening kind of growth afterwards. And that's how they hang on to and attach themselves to a support. And then there are tendrilit plants that have these long thread-like modified parts that act that are very sensitive to touch, and they wrap around a support, and that's how the plant climbs. So Darwin was interested in these because they show an active movement. And the most important and largest class of these climbers are called stem twiners. And they twine, and that is to say that they go around a support. And I don't know if you can see my hand here, but what's happening in these stem twiners is that as they grow up, they are nodding around, and that is a motion called circumnutation. It's a term that Darwin coined, by the way. Circa means around, and nutare is the Latin verb meaning to climb. And as a plant, all plants and all organs of plants, as they grow, as they elongate, they show this circumnutation movement. When they mature, they stop circumnutation. But the apices of stems that are still elongating, they show this circumnutation movement, this nodding around. Think of the Queen of England in a parade, and she's waving her hand like this. Well, what happens is that these plants that are showing the circumnutation movement, this nodding around, and I guess you've got to watch me here on the video, but they're nodding around like this, and then they hit a support, and they just keep nodding around. They keep this circumnutation movement, and they climb up the support. This has nothing to do with the sensitivity to touch. It is simply a physical, mechanical response. It's a continuation of the momentum of this circumnutation movement. Darwin gives a very nice analogy. He says, imagine a person who's swinging a lasso over their head, and then that rope hits a post, and it will climb up the post, spiral up that post because of the momentum of that rope. That's how these climbing plants work. So what natural selection has done and is modify the circumnutation movement, which is in all species, in all organs. All parts of the plant circumnutate, and natural selection has modified the stem circumnutations by simply amplifying it. So it is a wider nodding around. And once a plant does that, it is capable of climbing. This, by the way, is the Japanese honeysuckle over here. And this is a time-lapse photograph. Every 2 hours, this plant was photographed. And this is a composite photograph. And you can see how the apical portions of that stem that are still elongating, how they are nodding around. And this over here on the right is Arabidopsis. There's 4 different photos there, and you can see the stem in 4 different positions. Again, all plants, as they grow, they just don't go straight up. They move around like this. That's called circumnutation, a very important way that plants grow. And circumnutation is not a growth response. It's a spontaneous movement. That's the way that plants grow. And evolution, natural selection, has modified that response to give us climbing plants. And when I talk about Darwin's last book, The Power of Movements in Plants, we'll see some other examples. Darwin also commented on the chirality, the handedness of climbing. It turns out that in this world, about 10% of the climbing plants are left-handed climbers. That is, they climb from going in the lower right here, up a support to the upper left. And about 90%, by far the largest amount, is, excuse me, climbs from the right-handed climbers. They go from the lower left to the upper right as they twine around a support. And again, I want to emphasize that this twining has nothing at all to do with the sensitivity to touch or thigmotropism. Darwin did not find any examples of twining plants that were sensitive to touch. And by the way, let me just go back and say, this has nothing to do with northern or southern hemisphere. I'm always asked this. It has not, nothing to do with, they don't twine differently in the northern, southern hemisphere. This is in floras all over the world. You get about that ratio, 10% left-handed, 90% right-handed. Darwin was also fascinated by the movement of tendrils because it's a very specific movement and also a very rapid movement. Tendrils show three different kinds of movements. First of all, when they're formed, they often sweep out a large area, and that helps them find a substrate, a support to which they can attach. And after they come in contact with that support, they're sensitive to touch, and the tip of the tendril will curl around that support and grab onto it. So that's the second kind of movement. And then the third kind of movement happens in the free portion of the tendril. That free portion of the tendril coils helically, and it pulls, that coiling has the effect of pulling the plant towards the support. So that plant is really firmly attached to the support. And also that coiling acts like a spring, so that during, say, a rainstorm or a windstorm, the plant has some spring there and the tendril is not snapped. Another interesting thing that Darwin talks about, and you can see it here, is something called an inversion point. That's where the secondary coiling on the tendril changes its direction from clockwise to counterclockwise. And Darwin pointed out that you always have an even number of these inversion points here. These inversion points apparently relieve the strain on the tendril, and if they didn't occur, these tendrils would rupture from the strain. So he talks about that, excuse me. And so this is called an inversion point. Physicists that study this, the tension in this system and so forth, call this a perversion. They don't use the word inversion, they call it perversion. So if you do a Google search on tendril perversion, you will get many, many hits. This kind of coiling, by the way, occurs in many places in nature. You see it in the placentae of mammals. You see it in how DNA is packed into chromosomes. So it's received a lot of attention. But you find it here in plants, in tendrils, and Darwin really delighted in talking about this movement. Again, a lot of this is sensitivity to touch, known as thigmotropism. Well, Darwin's third book is on insectivorous plants. And the significance of this book is simply that Darwin was really the first scientist to prove to the world that there are plants that are out there in nature that specifically are adapted to attract, to lure, and trap and digest insects. That notion was very controversial in Darwin's days. Most people didn't believe that. And that may sound funny to us because we've grown up with the notion that there are insectivorous or carnivorous plants. But in Darwin's time, that was controversial. And it's really not a silly idea. Right outside the window from where I'm talking, across the street, there's a large cottonwood tree. That cottonwood, the buds on that cottonwood are covered with a very sticky resin. That resin traps insects, but the cottonwood does not digest insects and absorb the nutrients. It's not an insectivorous plant. On the window, which is to my right, my wife and I cultivate petunias, and the stems of petunias are covered with these tiny little viscid hairs, and they trap gnats and very small flies. But as far as I know, the petunia is not an insectivorous plant. It has no mechanism of digesting those insects and absorbing their remains. So the idea that just seeing insects stuck to a plant meant that they were carnivorous and they were eaten by the plant, that's not correct. And a lot of people in Darwin's time, they would see insects stuck to the sundew or the butterwort, plants that we know today are carnivorous. And they would say, oh, that's just a casual thing. There's really nothing to it. Well, Darwin started studying insectivorous plants, And he realized they had many adaptations, structures, and behaviors that specifically lured, trapped, and digested insects. And his favorite plant to study was Drosera, the Sundew genus, in particular Drosera rotundifolia, which grew in the area where he lived. And Droseras are very common worldwide. There's a lot of species. They all have these leaves that have these long tentacles. These are multicellular appendages of the leaf. So here's the leaf blade right here. Here is the leaf stalk. Again, the leaf blade, the leaf stalk, and the blade has all these tentacles. These are multicellular structures. And at the tip, there's a thickened group of cells that secrete a glue, and the insect gets tangled in that glue. If an insect lands on that leaf, it gets tangled in the glue. But not only that, the tendrils will bend in response to touch. They are thigmotropic. And Darwin spent a lot of time studying this bending phenomena. He would go out with a fine camel hair's brush and he would touch the tentacles. He would touch the tentacles in various places to see which were the most sensitive parts. He would also sometimes use a little blade of grass. And what he found was if you touch the apex of the tentacle, down here, lower down on that tentacle is where you had the bending occurring. And what that bending does is it brings the trapped insect into the center of that leaf where it'll touch more tentacles and get even more entwined, stuck onto that leaf. And so Darwin said, hey, there must be, because there's a stimulus here perceived at the tip, there must be a signal that is transmitted down to this lower portion where the bending occurs. So here you can see on the right some dragonflies, which are pretty hefty for an insect, and they're trapped by a species of sundew, Drosera. These are really sticky traps. Darwin experimented on the sundew. He had over 60 different kinds of substances that he put on these leaves. For example, over here on the right, there's a piece of meat there that he put on this side of the leaf. And you can see how all the tendrils have curled over that and are on that piece of meat, trapping it there. This is a leaf that was put in an ammonium phosphate or biphosphate solution, and that caused all of the tendrils to flex inward. What Darwin found was that these tendrils flexed very rapidly as long as a substance had soluble nitrogen in it. If you put, say, crushed glass or a piece of sand or a piece of charcoal, that would not induce the tendrils to bend, to inflex inwards. But the tendrils only did that if they had a soluble nitrogen was in whatever was put on them. Cheese was another one of his favorites. And so the plant appears to be adapted for trapping insects. And this, Darwin says, is not casual. This is an adaptation. It must have been put there by natural selection. And he had a lot of fun with this plant. Over 60% of his book on insectivorous plants is about Drosera, the sundews. One of the things that Darwin did is he took some of the plants that grew in his area and near his home, and he sent them to his friend and colleague, Burdon Sanderson, who is an electrophysiologist, studied nerve impulses in animals. And Sanderson detected what's called an action potential. That is like a small little electric current in these tendrils when they were, in these tentacles on the leaf when they were stimulated. And this was caused a lot of interest because it reminds one of the nervous impulses of animals. Darwin discusses many different insectivorous plants in this book. He discusses the famous Venus flytrap. He talks about the 3 hairs that occur here on the lamina. There's 3 hairs on that lamina, and that lamina will close if the 3 hairs are triggered. I think you need 2 or 3 hairs that the insect needs to touch. If you just touch 1 hair, it will not close completely. But if you touch 2 or more, it will close. And he studied that, excuse me, he studied that. He also studied this plant, Aldrovanda, which is a water plant that has a similar trap mechanism. He talks about that in the book. And Utricularia, the bladderworts. They're a fascinating group. They have these tiny little leaves. You see in the upper right there, you see these tiny bladders. They're only about 1 millimeter long, and they open and close rapidly, and they will suck in aquatic insects and little crustaceans, and then secrete digestive enzymes and then absorb them, the remains of those trapped organisms. So Darwin's next book was The Effects of Cross-Fertilization and Self-Fertilization in the Vegetable Kingdom. Remember, in his first book, which was on the pollination of orchids, what Darwin found is nearly all the examples he studied was that the plants were adapted towards outcrossing. The pollen from the flower of one individual being transferred over to a flower, to the stigma on the flower of another individual of a different plant. Well, why should that be? Darwin spent 11 years and examined more than 300 plants, most of which were sent to him by hooker at Kew, to find out what were the relative advantages and disadvantages of selfing, that is pollination within the same flower or the same plant, and outcrossing. And this is the result in this book. He first noticed, just casually, when he looked at the common toadflax, Linaria vulgaris, he had some plants that for another reason he selfed them, and then he grew the seeds from those selfings, and then he crossed other plants and he grew the progeny from those crossings, and it was immediately apparent just to his eye that the crossed plants were much more vigorous. They were much more robust in any way that you wanted to measure. If you wanted to look at this, just the biomass of the individuals, the number of fruits they produce, the number of seeds that those fruits contain, the weight of the seeds, any measure that you wanted to take, the crossed plants were more robust. There were a few exceptions, but that was by far the general rule. These other plants, the digitalis, the dianthus, the carnations, these are some other plants that he worked on. But Darwin felt that the reason why outcrossing was the general rule in the plant kingdom is because it produced more robust offspring, healthier offspring, and that would therefore serve the species in the struggle for existence as these plants had to grow up and contend with the environment. The different forms of flowers on plants of the same species. This is a fascinating book. I think Darwin's just recognizing that this should be these different species that have different forms of flowers should be grouped together and studied, was very perceptive on his part. He first noticed this phenomenon in Primula veris. Primula veris are the cowslips. They're abundant in southern England. And it was widely known, even to school kids, that there were two forms of flowers on these plants. The cowslips produced what they call pin and thrum flowers. These flowers are heterostylous. If you look down here in the lower right, you can see there's these two forms of flowers. The petals have been cut away for clarity. These are illustrations from Darwin's books. One flower was the long-styled flower. Here's the ovary, here's the style, and here's the sticky stigma that receives the pollen. And then you had short-styled flowers. Here's the ovary, you get a shorter style, and then the stigma. Note that the anthers, the pollen sacs, are in different places. They're down here on the floral tube in the long-styled flowers, and they're up here on the short-styled flowers. And in Darwin's time, scientists knew about this variation, and everybody just said, yeah, this is just variation without any significance whatsoever. It does not need to be explained. And Darwin said, no, that variation exists. It is real. And if my theory of evolution by natural selection is correct, then there must be some adaptive significance, because that's the only way that selection could have put it there. So Darwin went about doing breeding experiments. What he did is now I want to make one thing clear. Let me back up just a minute. These two forms of flowers, the long-styled and short-styled flowers, are on different individuals, the same species, but they're on different individuals. individual plants. So what Darwin did is he took these different plants and he made the crosses. He would take pollen, say from this plant here, the short-styled form, and he would place it on the stigma of a short-styled flower. And what he found was that the pollen rarely germinated. If it did germinate, pollen tube growth was weak and there was very little fruit and seed set. However, if you took the pollen from a short-styled flower and transferred it to the stigma of a long-styled flower, you got abundant fruit and seed set. He called this first thing where you do a selfing on the flower. He called that an illegitimate union. And he called this a legitimate union where you got a lot of fruit set and seed set. So what Darwin concluded was, because these two kinds of flowers are found on different individuals, that this is an adaptation for outcrossing. These flowers only work, so to speak. Pollination is only successful if you have cross-pollination between different individuals. So again, here was another example, as in the orchid book, he was finding that this was an adaptation to outcrossing, promoting outcrossing. And he was very pleased at this discovery. He wrote in his autobiography, "No small discovery of mine has given me so much pleasure as determining the significance of heterostyled flowers." And there are a lot of plants that are heterostyled that are probably familiar to you. Michella repens, the partridge berry, is one such plant. Epigea repens, the trailing arbutus, is another plant. And the common garden pulmonaria, lungwort, is heterostylous. Now, what I just showed you with Primulaveris, the cowslips, that was distylous. There are two forms of flowers. Some flowers have three different forms, and this is one, Lythrum salicarium, the hated Purcell loosestrife. It has three different forms of flowers. Darwin examined this. There's 18 different crosses that you can make here. See, there's a short style there, there's a medium styled flower and a long styled flower. Again, these are all on plants, individuals of same species, different individuals. He made all the crosses, there's 18 different combinations, and he counted over 21,000 seeds to get his results. And he found that these flowers are adapted for outcrossing. If you self-pollinate a plant or the same kind of flower, it will not produce much seed or fruit. Another great example of tristyly, three forms of flowers, is in oxalis, the wood sorrel. Here you can see short, medium, and long-styled flowers. Eichhornia crassipes, the water hyacinth, which is such a terrible weed in many parts of the world, is tristylous, as is Pontidaria cordata in the same family, the pickerel weed. Another thing that Darwin talked about in this book is Cleistogamy. Cleistogamy means hidden marriage. You have, and violet is a great example. Here's a normal chasmogamous flower on a violet. That means it's a showy flower. And violets produce around their base cleistogamous flowers. These hidden flowers, they never open and they self-pollinate. The pollen grows from the pollen tube through the ovary wall and it pollinates the ovules in the ovary, and they produce abundant seeds. So this was an exception. Here were some flowers that were self-pollinating. They weren't outcrossing like Darwin found in many other plants. And Darwin discusses this phenomenon and he says, I think these seeds are a backup system. So if the normal showy flowers have a poor year, they're not pollinated, or the pollinator is hurt by bad weather or something, these cleistogamous flowers could produce abundant seed because they're self-fertilizing, and that would act as a backup system in the species survival. Many of these cleistogamous flowers are born underground, excuse me. They are born underground. Here's Polygala, which is a great example. These are the normal chasmogamous flowers here. And then here you have these underground, non-showy, self-pollinating cleistogamous flowers. Many grasses are cleistogamous. Their inflorescences, that is the flower clusters, do not become exerted out of the grass sheaths that they're born in. That's because they don't need to be wind pollinated. They're pollinated within that grass sheath on the plant, and they don't need to be exposed to the air to catch pollen. And Darwin talks a lot about cleistogamy in grasses. Now, finally, his last book, his sixth and last book, is The Power of Movement in Plants. It's a rather thick book. It's about 600 pages, and I thought it would be rather daunting to read, but I found this to be his most brilliant book. What Darwin does in this book is basically this. He looks at three different kinds of movements in plants. Gravitropism, which is the response, the growth towards or away from gravity, up or down. Phototropism, which you see here in the middle. Phototropism is the growth towards or away from light. Most plants grow towards a light. And then nyctinasty, which is the sleep movements of plants. That's when the leaflets typically go down. They may go up, but they change their orientation at night. They usually sink down at night, and then they open up in the next morning to present more surface area to the sun. Darwin looked at these three different movements in plants, and he said all of them are derived from the same source. They're all derived from that circumnutation movement of plant. Natural selection has taken the circumnutation movement, which is inherent in all species of plants and most all organs of plants, and it has modified that circumnutation movement to create these three different kinds of movements. So gravitropism, up in the growth upward or downward, is modified circumnutation. So is phototropism. If you put a plant in the windowsill, it doesn't just go straight towards the brightness outside. It circumnutates by gradually favoring one side of that circumnutation movement over the other, and it bends towards the light source by that kind of modified circumnutation. And same with nyctinasty. Here's an example in the star fruit. Probably many of you have seen this fruit or eaten it, found it in the grocery store. It has these pinnately compound leaves. And late in the afternoon, these leaflets on the compound leaf, they droop down. Over here on the right is a graph from Darwin's book. And on the horizontal axis of this graph, you see it starts over here at 5 in the afternoon, and it ends over here at 6:30. And then on the vertical axis, you have an angle from the horizontal. And this is measuring the leaflets and how they gradually droop down into that final drooping position that it passes the night in. And what you see is the leaflets start drooping down, and then they reverse direction and they start going up. And then they droop down a little bit more, and then they reverse direction, they go up a little bit less, and so on until you get over here to 6:30 when those leaflets are completely drooping. And so what this is showing that these leaflets aren't just moving downwards, drooping downwards in a straight fashion. They are modifying their circumnutation movement. And that's what natural selection has done here. It has modified the inherent circumnutation movement. It's selected for that to produce this effect. Now, unfortunately, Darwin wasn't quite sure what was the advantage of having your leaflets or leaves droop down. He wasn't sure of the selective advantage of nyctinasty, the sleep movements, but he gives it a lot of attention in the book. He also studied circumnutation in all the different plant parts. He studies it here in the roots of seedlings, the young embryonic root that you see at germination. That's called a radicle. And even that circumnutates. Darwin showed that the cotyledons will circumnutate. And he developed very clever ways of showing and documenting circumnutation in shoots. Here he has up above here on the left, he's got a drawing, a tracing board, and then he's got a card down here with a black spot on it, and he glued a very thin needle with a ball of black wax at his tip, and he would line up the black spot on that card with the black ball of wax on the needle, and he would make these tracings that look like what you see over here. He did thousands of those tracings for many different species in his book. He was very thorough. Darwin, in this book, The Power of Movement in Plants, describes some experiments that he did, which were very famous. They're repeated in basic botany courses today. If you germinate grass seedlings, as Darwin did, they grow towards the light source. They bend towards the light source. Darwin noted that if you cut off the apex, look at this middle illustration here, if you cut off the apex of the seedling, that bending does not take place. Well, maybe that's just because the seedling was damaged, traumatized. What Darwin then did is keep the apex intact, and he put a tinfoil cover over the cap that did not allow light to get in. It blocked the light. And what happened in those cases is that the seedling did not bend towards the light source. So Darwin said there must be a stimulus. The light stimulus is perceived by the plant at the apex of that seedling. And there must be a signal transmitted from the apex down lower where the bending occurs. And what that signal was, he didn't know. But to make a very long story short, this set of experiments led to the discovery of auxin by a Dutch plant physiologist, Fritz Wendt, and his collaborators in the 1920s. And Darwin is considered the father of plant growth substances or plant growth regulators because of these experiments. He's very famous in plant physiology. Again, those experiments were described in this book. Well, so that's Darwin's last book, The Power of Movement in Plants. There are two very good, if you want to read more about Darwin's work on plants, there are two very good books that are popular accounts for the public about him and his plant work. The first was published in 1977 by Mia Allen. It's called Darwin and His Flowers. And the second one came out in 2018, just recently, by Ken Thompson, who's a researcher at the University of Sheffield in England. And both are excellent accounts. I particularly like the more recent one. He has in it many updates about the plants and phenomena that Darwin studied. But both are excellent, and you can get them online. So if you want to read more about Darwin and plants, these are two books I would recommend. But I would also recommend, if you can find the time, to read Darwin in the original. I would recommend that this book on the movements and habits of climbing plant that you see here on the left. This book is one of his shortest books, and if you by reading him in the original, that's the only way that you're going to get the full flavor of Darwin as a very keen observer, a very skillful experimentalist. He wasn't just an observer. He did a lot of experiments. He was very clever about it. He was also a masterful synthesizer of facts. And you'll only get that. You won't get it from listening to my talk or even reading those two books that I just showed you. You've got to read them in the original. And he often makes it easy for you. He'll put ancillary information in smaller type, and that, you can skip it unless you want to get the same details over again. So he helps you in that sense. So I would strongly suggest, if you've got the time, to read Darwin in the original. It's really a good experience. And so I hope that the next time that you hear about Darwin or see something about him, that you'll think about him more holistically, not just as a zoologist or a geologist even, but as a botanist surrounded by many interesting and wonderful plants like you see him here. I've really enjoyed putting this talk together and being here today, and I hope you've enjoyed listening. Thank you very much.
Wow, Robbin, bravo. Thank you so much. Our audience has been very enthusiastic this whole time in the chat, sharing their delight and wonder with everything that you've shared with us. So thank you on behalf of all of them. And it's now time for the Q&A. At this time, audience members, if you haven't already, please go ahead and add questions that you have by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can also upvote questions that others have already submitted. And this is going to be key to getting to the questions that are most popular among our audience today. So we have a few questions actually on the topic of circumnutation. And a lot of folks were interested in the concept of chirality, so rotating to the left or the right. And we have a few questions that were kind of similar, so I wanted to kind of ask all at once. When you're talking about right-handed versus left-handed, the 90 to 10%, are you talking about within a species, different individuals, or are you talking about between species?
I'm talking about between species. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on that. Between species. And usually the direction of climbing is constant within a genus. Darwin talks about this. There are some groups that have both left-handed and right-handed climbers, but it's It's usually constant within a species and within a genus. And one other thing I might add is that there are many excellent circumnutation videos on YouTube. I'm not sure I did mention that, but go to YouTube, search on circumnutation, and you'll see some great examples.
I shared one in the chat as well, which I'm happy to do again for our audience. And is there any reason that we know of for why the left-handed versus right-handed pattern exists?
No, it's not known at all. And like I say, this is true in both the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. It's true in our flora here in North America. It's true down in Costa Rica, where I do a lot of work. It's about 10% left-handed climbers, 90% right-handed climbers. But we don't know of any adaptive significance. And interestingly, although Darwin points this out in the book, the difference between the chirality and climbing, he really doesn't say much about it. He did not know the adaptive significance of that trait, if there is any.
Thank you. That's very informative. A few folks have wondered about the difference between movement in plants and growth in plants when it comes to climbers. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Sure. It really is a growth movement. And what I mean by that is it depends on the elongation of cells. This circumnutation movement, which is central to which is what natural selection has modified for a lot of these growth responses. If you look at my hand, I don't know if you can see my hand here on the video, but on a stem, if you think of my hand here and my wrist as a stem, an upright stem, what happens is that the cells on one side of that stem will elongate. And as they elongate, they push over to one side, the shoot or the stem. And this zone of elongation, of elongating cells, migrates around the stem. And as it migrates around the stem, it pushes that stem around like this, and that results in that circumnutation movement. So the circumnutation results from unelongation of zones of cells on one side of the stem. So just to, if I may illustrate this with the phototropism, which is the bending, let's say, towards light. You put a plant in the windowsill, it bends towards the light source. What's happening there is that as that shoot, that is the stem and the leaves, as it grows upwards, that circumnutation movement is modified so that you get more bending on the darker side. This zone of elongation, of elongating cells, elongates more, and it pushes over that shoot towards the light, and that's how you get the bending. That bending, phototropism, is modified circumnutation. And it was genius of Darwin to realize that gravitropism, phototropism, nyctinasty, they're all three derived from the same source. I look at those movements and they look like three totally different unrelated movements to my mind, but Darwin saw this similarity in them. And I think his ability to see that similarity in these apparently disparate phenomena, that is genius.
Wonderful, thank you. And you answered another question that had come up too about the mechanism of phototropism. So thanks you for answering that as well in advance. We have a question about heterostyly. Why is it advantageous, again, for cross-pollination? And also for our audience, if you can clarify, why does Darwin think that cross-pollination in general is advantageous to plants and animals?
Sure. Well, first of all, he felt that outcrossing, cross-pollination, was advantageous. He first saw this in the orchid book, where most of the examples that he found, the flowers he studied, were adapted for outcrossing. Well, why should that be the general rule? He then later in this book, The Effects of Selfing and Crossing in the Plant Kingdom, what he found was when he experimentally selfed plants or crossed plants, the offspring of those plants that were outcrossed to the pollination occurred between different individuals, different plants, that those offspring were always healthier. They produced more flowers, they produced more seeds, the seeds weighed more, they grew better. And so they had hybrid vigor, so to speak. And that term, hybrid vigor, is a term that Darwin coined. Presumably, these outcrossing plants were healthier, more robust, and that was the adaptive significance. They could compete better in the struggle for life. Now, to get to the heterostyly question, It's that same general principle about outcrossing and the healthiness of outcrossed offspring is what is apparently going on here. Heterostyle basically forces you to be an outcrosser, because selfing is a very poor seed and fruit set in a heterostylous plant of itself. They're almost forced to be outcrossing. Same with tristilous plants. And outcrossing results in healthier, more robust offspring. And that's the significance of that.
And comparing that to the violet example, do the seeds from the Cleistogamous flowers that are grown, that are self-crossing, do they have limitations in their germinations rates? Are they not as evolutionarily adaptive as the seeds that are produced through outcrossing?
In other words, are they as robust and healthy as the seeds produced by the normal chasmogamous flowers? That, I actually don't know the answer to that. And I think that Darwin does comment on that and examine that, but I'm not quite sure offhand. Let me tell you one thing. If you have violets in your yard and they're all over your yard, like a lot of my neighbors do, if you're out there picking out those chasmogamous flowers, the showy flowers in the spring, thinking that that'll reduce the number of weedy violets in your front yard, you will not be successful, because they produce later on in the summer those short cleistogamous flowers, which are barely noticeable, and they're inconspicuous. They invest all their money, all their energy into not petals and sepals, but they invest all their energy into producing a lot of pollen and seeds, and those cleistogamous flowers produce hundreds, thousands of seeds, and they're dispersed all over your yard. They seem pretty efficient, those cleistogamous flowers, but Darwin felt that cleistogamy and self-fertilization can only go on so far, that species would have to eventually outcross and get a mixing of different genes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're running out of time at this point. There are lots of great questions. I have one more question for you here. It's a little historical. I'm not sure if you may know the answer, but are there any botanical gardens that have specifically designed a Darwin garden that showcase the plants that Darwin studied?
Oh, that's a great question. And I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that many gardens, including the New York Botanical Garden, have had special Darwin shows that last 3 or 4 months, where they brought together many of the plants that he studied. And, but I do not know offhand of any particular botanical garden that, say, may have a room in a greenhouse that is filled with the plants that Darwin studied. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, that's an invitation for someone out there to create one, I think. All right. Well, thank you so much, Robbin. I really appreciate your time. Everyone in the audience was really thrilled with your presentation. So thank you once again for joining us and telling us about Darwin's botanical legacy.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Great. And thank you again to our audience for joining today. If you missed any part of this event or wish to watch it again, a recording will be saved and shared on the NYBG lecture library. We hope you'll join us for future science, conservation, and humanities lectures from the New York Botanical Garden. Next Friday, January 29th, we'll have one more plant science talk by newly Emeritus Curator, Dr. Waite Thomas. He'll speak to us about his taxonomic work on sedges, that's the Cyperaceae family, and his floristic work in the northeastern coastal forests of Brazil. For those who haven't already registered for our mailing list, go ahead and sign up. I'm going to put a link in the chat in just a moment. So until next time, please stay well, stay green, take care, and goodbye, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.